The crisis of illegal immigration along the Canada-U.S. border has reached a new pinnacle. According to Canadian Border Services Agency President Jean-Pierre Fortune, as many as 500 people are illegally crossing into Quebec every single day. More than 10,000 migrants have walked across the border this year, choosing deliberately to cross at an unofficial crossing to avoid the Safe Third Country Agreement between Canada and the U.S. This bilateral agreement requires asylum seekers to make their refugee claims in the first safe country they arrive in, and not just pass through one country to get to another. Far from stopping asylum claimers from coming into Canada via the U.S., this agreement has simply led aspiring refugees to cross into Canada illegally at unmanned border crossings and to deliberately circumvent our immigration rules. And rather than cracking down on this dangerous and illegal activity, the Trudeau government has just looked the other way. Worse, they've pounded their own drum of generosity and given many the impression that Canada will welcome any and all refugees, no matter the circumstance. Trudeau has ignored this problem for so long that he's now lost control of it. The sheer logistics of dealing with the latest surge of border jumpers is overwhelming the resources of the CBSA. When a migrant arrives in Canada to make a refugee claim, whether they've crossed into Canada illegally at one of these unmanned border crossings, or whether they arrive unannounced at an official border crossing or airport, Canada always follows the same very rigid procedure. Initial security screening and vetting, which takes about 8 hours, is typically done within the first 72 hours of arrival. The recent explosion in illegal crossings, however, has significantly shifted these standards. According to media reports, there are simply too many applications to process as they come in. Asylum seekers are therefore being sent to Montreal until this initial screening can be complete. But according to Richard Goldman of the Committee to Aid Refugees, rather than the typical 72 hours to complete initial vetting, these appointments are being scheduled 1 or 2 months later. 1 or 2 months later, a migrant arriving unannounced and entering illegally is being sent to Montreal and told to come back 1 or 2 months later to receive initial screening and vetting? Before the Canadian government has determined if a person poses a national security risk to Canada, to determine whether or not they're a terrorist, a war criminal, a fugitive, or a drug dealer, they're sent to live freely in Montreal. Before we know if they're even eligible for refugee status in Canada, if they have health problems that would make them inadmissible, or if they have had a previous history in Canada, we just release them and hope for the best. We simply trust that they're going to bother to show up to this initial admissibility hearing some 2 months later. In other words, the Trudeau government has lost all control over this situation. They're putting an astonishing amount of trust in people whose very first act in Canada was to deliberately break our laws. And the problem is only expected to get worse. Donald Trump is considering removing the U.S.'s temporary protected status for Haitians who were displaced after the 2010 earthquake. So rather than returning to the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, as many as 60,000 people could be making their way north instead. Trudeau is responding to this crisis, not surprisingly, by doing nothing to stop the flow of illegal immigration. Trudeau is refusing to stand up for Canadians. He's putting his own reputation as the most generous and progressive leader in the world ahead of Canada's national security. For the Rebel Media, I'm Candice Malcolm. Thanks so much for watching. We are trying to build a mobile app. Please support us by visiting theycan'tstopus.com.